So welcome everybody to the Decennial Urban Studies Conference. This conference has been organized by the undergraduate group of the Urban Studies program. The inspiration comes from them, the ideas for it, the speaker invitations suggested. It's really a labor of love on their part, I hope, and they are going to be involved in the entire program, introducing what they are doing as well as the speakers they've invited. They chose actually the title of the conference, The City Off the Hill, and to make it clear, we added working together for sustainable urbanism. The idea was that we could have a taking stock of urban change over the last decade, as has been done for the last 30 years actually at Brown. In 1982, Brown sponsored its first large urban conference on the city, drawing key leaders and scholars to discuss urban issues. And they initially used the theme, "Who will save the American city?" And in 1982, the themes that they were referring to were questions of affordable housing, the economy, what was going to happen to organized labor with deindustrialization, the rising crime rates in the cities and the urban poor. And it was back then that homelessness appeared to be a new problem. So, in fact, if you think back then, the appearance of people sleeping on the streets was a very new thing. And yet there's still problems today. And then another conference looked 10 years later at urban problems, but this time they featured big city mayors, and so we're inspired to do that as well. But the topics then included how cities and suburbs would relate to one another, and the perennial problems of the economy and poverty remained on the agenda. While they looked forward to the 21st century, I have to say that it's not clear that urban affairs has remained a burning priority at the federal level, certainly. Urban problems seem to have risen in the public consciousness during the 1960s, but unless you have some major sort of disorders, it tends to subside and sink out of public attention, out of the public eye. And yet, of course, most people care much more in terms of their daily lives with what goes on in their own localities. So in 2002, there was an optimistic theme, the city no limits. Obviously, it was intended as a play off of the famous City Limits book by Paul Peterson. But there they raised some new concerns. They had a rethink, and issues of international immigration that was making a strong impact on our cities came to the fore, as well as issues of innovation both within education and through the economy. And this was a time when people began to think about how the arts could serve as a catalyst for economic change. And as you know, in the last decade, Providence has even adopted the slogan of the creative capital in keeping with that theme. And author Tom Wolfe, if you remember back, Bonfire of the Vanities, was one of the key speakers at that time. Today, cities are moving beyond the relatively narrow idea of creative capital as an economic driver, and are thinking about what are sometimes called the anchor institutions of urban economies. Those institutions that are not going to pick up and move elsewhere, and are more likely to attract people into a city rather than export jobs. The idea of these anchor institutions, or EDs and NEDs as they're familiarly called, is that they can nurture new forms of innovation through the biomedical sector, through high technology. And there are some really nice examples. Most recently, the HUD newsletter for this winter actually highlighted Portland State and its partnerships with the larger cities. So this is at the moment very much at the forefront of urban economic development policies. And here in Providence, of course, our version is the Knowledge District. So City Off the Hill as a theme was an attempt to say, look, there's no magic bullet that's going to solve perennial urban problems. Rather, the way to solve it is to go beyond it, thinking about a single savior of a city, and rather to try and find fresh solutions together through collaboration, not simply in the universities where supposedly all creative innovation originates, but actually, yeah, I see all the patents that are just, coming out of the ground. And to actually get off of College Hill and to engage with the many actors and the many interests of the city. So this was our students' charge, and for the next 2 days we're going to be exploring how it is that we can improve urban life in a comprehensive or holistic way and with many different interests involved. So we have 3 main conference themes to explore this idea. One is the idea of sustainable urbanism. What we want to do is not focus purely on sustainability, which would be a concern with environment per se, but rather how to think about sustainable urbanism with an emphasis on re-envisioning the city. Second, we want to explore how to move beyond silos, beyond the traditional agency bureaucracies that tend to be self-enclosed, and to encourage comprehensive planning where people work together across specialties and expertise. And third, a kind of city building that's inclusive, so that partnerships are open and all voices can be heard. So to start with sustainable urbanism, obviously greening is very hot right now. The Obama administration has encouraged us to think about energy efficiency and has provided through the Recovery Act new ways to improve our infrastructure. And there the emphasis has been traditionally or primarily on resource conservation and recovery and reducing the environmental footprint of the city, the impact that we have on the environment. And some of the new themes in urban environmental studies include things like alternative energy, green buildings, using historic preservation as a way of encouraging adaptive reuse, making brownfields reusable after they've been polluted, developing land trusts for foreclosed housing. Everybody's favorite right now are the High Line parks along the old rail lines throughout older cities, and of course cycling to work. The city itself is green, and the urban environment, the natural environment of cities has also been receiving considerable attention. This is true on the one hand, thinking about the green space, the parks and the trees that are in the city, but even the urban wildlife, as we see, is something to, it's a very special habitat for wildlife, and we'll hear about that tomorrow. But also food production on vacant lots to reuse land and so on is part of the greening impulse of sustainable urbanism. But experts in this area say that the natural and the built environment they interact and they have to be taken into account together. And so while we reconnect with nature, there are also many other kinds of livability, and obviously cities are also homes of civilization. And so the built environment, the man-made environment, needs to work better in balance with the natural habitat. So production in economic activities have to be balanced with the consumption and recreational uses of space. And this also poses new challenges for governance. It's not simply that as we'll discuss in a moment, that participation has to be broadened, but natural disasters as well as man-made disasters, we need to prepare for those. Cities are complex places, and we've seen how cities can be more or less resilient in the face of such natural disasters. Finally, how all those activities get fit together in a dense and mutually reinforcing, positively reinforcing way is really the task of good urban design. I know this is going to move forward there. So what we want to do is achieve an inclusive, accessible, these are the goals that I think we all discussed, an inclusive, accessible, and sustainable city, and they would include such goals as renewed, high-tech, energy-efficient infrastructure, denser, more affordable housing, preserving cultural heritage and a sense of place, pedestrian access to services, cycling, and energy-efficient transport, green spaces, recreational land uses, and access to healthy food and living environments. As for working together, traditionally housing and community development fell under the purview of HUD, and transportations were often developed in isolation. So housing and transportation didn't necessarily talk to one another, which is very unfortunate, as we saw, because sometimes transportation innovations went to spur housing development. And Greg, our first speaker, is an expert in explaining how it is that our latest form of transportation, air travel, spurs development around it. But it's also been the reverse, that sometimes housing speculators would find cheap land and then leave it for the public sector or developers to figure out how to deal with the ensuing transportation commuting problems, as we see, say, in the Princeton corridor, for example. So not coordinating these activities really has substantial costs, and neither of these agencies really concern themselves with open public space, which continues to be a major challenge when land is commodified. So we're starting to see that open space is being regained, but we see in the current foreclosure crisis that, in fact, all of these are interrelated problems. So it's not simply as cities grow that transportation, housing, and environment are interrelated and create complex problems, but also as growth subsides, that it creates problems that tend to cascade from one sector to the next. So today, agencies join up in their policy making, and the public sector doesn't try to solve problems alone. It works in partnership with the private sector. And so these solutions, sometimes it involves outsourcing by government, in which you have competitive bidding and allow the private sector to bring innovation to the fore. Or in other cases, the public sector will take the lead and in effect say, now it's time for better mileage, or time for high-speed rail, or other kinds of industrial policy. The nonprofit sector has become increasingly important, of course, in these partnerships. In housing and transportation, we see all kinds of nonprofit organizations and community organizations like biking groups, pressing governments for new alternatives. And we see it in Providence, and it's important to point out that our conference not only brought people from outside of the city, guests who are experts in these issues, but have brought experts for each panel from Providence. So you probably have heard that the Knowledge District is now attempting to green itself. There's a project to, map the energy flows and so forth in the Knowledge District. Or just this week, Gary Bliss has announced a program that the planning department is engaged in, where both Providence and Pittsburgh are the pilot cities for the Green and Healthy Homes Initiative. We have the Project Rebuild Act that has just been announced, but many of the local CDCs, community development corporations, are getting involved in that. And housing is about growing the economy too, if skilled workers, if workers are allowed to participate in that. And some of you may have seen just down by the mall, the famous box office. Well, it turns out that I just got an email yesterday that the architect of the box office is an Urban Studies alumna. So, we're very proud. But that's the reuse of old containers. So what do we have planned for you? Just as a quick overview, you all have programs in front of you now, but I just want to show you what we're going to be doing in the next 2 days. First, we're going to have an opening panel where the theme of comprehensive sustainable urbanism and smart growth will be discussed. This is an attempt to provide an overview of these themes. A second panel will then be comprised, if they're here, let me know if you're here, will be comprised of federal agency directors from the Boston region. We're now working together at the behest of the Obama administration. When President Obama was first elected, he created a White House Office for Urban Affairs, which then received the mandate to work across EPA, DOT, and HUD. And then we're lucky to have Mayor Tavares, who will be coming to introduce Mayor Ravensthal. And I just want to give everyone a heads up. Mayor Ravensthal will be speaking by, not satellite, video link. Many of you heard the terrible news that there were many people killed in Pittsburgh yesterday, and the mayor, of course, was unable to travel, so he could be on top of that. But he was very excited about participating, and we gave him the choice of passing on this, and he really wanted to do it. So we're very grateful to him for taking the time out to speak to us by video link. And then we're going to have a reception to which you're all very much cordially invited. Hopefully the ideas will percolate and new innovations will be created. Tomorrow we're going to have 3 subject matter thematic panels. One thinking about transportation alternatives, a second dealing with the greening of the environment, and the third thinking about housing and how we can provide more affordable and energy efficient housing. And then finally we'll have a guest from the Ford Foundation and the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce, trying to pull things together a bit for us across these 3 thematic special areas. And then we'll be done. Before we get started, I'd just very much like to make a few thank yous. First to our sponsors, I guess you'd say, the Harry David Goldberg Endowment, and I believe the Goldberg family is going to be joining us. I thank you for coming. We appreciate your being here. The Urban Studies Doug, all of you in the audience who are Urban Studies concentrators, thank you so much for your contributions and your ideas. I especially have to thank the Media Technology Group who stepped up at the last minute to get us hooked up to Pittsburgh. I want to thank Marissa Quinn and the Office of Public Affairs and University Relations and the Vice President who have helped us liaise with the larger city. And finally, please thank Heather Parker, who is our coordinator of this event and has worked tirelessly to deal with many last-minute changes. And I want to acknowledge her help. So thank you.
Hello, everybody. Sorry for that little
Snafu.
My name is Kate Blessing, and I'm a junior concentrator in the Urban Studies and History departments. I'm one of the co-leaders of the undergraduate departmental group, DUG. For those of you visiting Brown, concentrating is Brown speak for majoring. I want to welcome all of you to Brown University on this fine day. It's sunny, that's good. Not usually sunny in Providence. For City Off the Hill working together for sustainable urbanism. A conference obviously sponsored by the Urban Studies Department. Let us remember again that this conference could not have happened without the generosity of the Goldberg family. Thank you very much again. We would also like to welcome and thank all of our guests who are speaking this weekend. Thank you, everybody. And we would also like to thank Professor Hilary Silver, Heather Parker, and all of the Urban Studies students who worked to plan and put on this conference. You're scattered throughout the audience. Now I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I decided to concentrate in urban studies because of a book. Yes, a book. It's called The Origins of the Urban Crisis, written by Thomas Sugrue, and it's about my hometown of Detroit, Michigan. 50 years ago, Detroit was a glimmering beacon of what democracy could look like. Now, whatever narrative one takes, whether or not it includes accounts of the racial discrimination that now threaten to sully Detroit's rosy image as the arsenal of democracy, Detroit was once a resource-rich city, and now it's not. In Sugrue's book, I found an explanation of the city I saw today that did not revolve around the two-word attempts at explaining a set of historical trends that defy simplification. No, the race riot in the summer of 1967 was not solely responsible for the city's decline. No, it wasn't. Instead, Sugrue provides the reader with a new lens to approach the city's decline, dispelling historically racist discourse. He argues that yes, white flight did contribute to the city's decline, but so did other oft-overlooked historical trends like suburbanization, deindustrialization, discrimination, and segregation. Now, Detroit is not alone in its struggles with disinvestment. Scores of other cities across the country wrestle with similarly dwindling populations and declining tax bases. It's no surprise that I'm interested in the current livability of cities like Detroit, Providence, and Cleveland, not to mention other cities represented at this conference. I've pursued my interest in cities outside the classroom as well. For the past 2 summers, I've worked at nonprofit organizations in Detroit that aim to improve the quality of life for residents of the city. And this summer I hope to work in DC, either with the federal government or a policy research organization. Now I'm going to hand it over to Alex, my co-leader.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alison Pinsky, a junior concentrator from Youngstown, Ohio. And I became involved with the Urban Studies Department my freshman year after taking Professor Marone's class, City Politics. And for that class's final paper, I wrote about the redevelopment plan for my hometown that really pioneered the shrinking cities model. And in it, grassroots organizations, foundations, businesses, and government were all making strides together to make the city a more livable place for residents. And it was inspiring to me. And I knew in some role I wanted to go back and be a part of the efforts that had been started. And the day after I declared my concentrations, just a little about the department, Heather, whom I had just met, emailed me about a land bank conference in Detroit that Kate was attending. And we realized that the early bird registration was that night, the deadline was. So Heather helped me register that night. And I knew that the amount of help that would come from such a small department was incredible, and I knew it was a great department just from that little story. And That conference in Detroit was a great introduction to many urban issues, and I learned about projects happening throughout the country, and on top of this, I was inspired by all the creative work that was transforming Detroit. And it really gave me a new lens for how to view urban issues in all my classes. And as Austin Boxler, senior concentrator in the department, said, urban studies is the most brown concentration, meaning that everyone really has their own discipline and their own interests, and everyone brings it together around the issues that face cities. So a little about me. Last summer I worked for a neighborhood development corporation and got really interested in urban agriculture and economic development. And like many Rust Belt cities, these are one and the same. So this summer I'm starting a small urban farm in a low-income neighborhood in Youngstown. So, and everyone in the program has been incredibly helpful. So a little bit about the history of the conference. It reaches back long before either Kate or I came to Brown. And the Providence Journal first sponsored a public affairs conference with a focus on urban affairs in 1982 and then in 1992 and 2002. And the conference drew former Senator and presidential hopeful Bill Bradley and mayors from Boston, Detroit, San Diego, Knoxville, and Cleveland, to name a few.
Now, Professor Silver has hinted at this in her little speech before, but in planning this conference, 30 years later, we recognize the need for a new title. Who are we to assume that one person or a small group of people could save the American city, or that it even needed saving in the first place? Granted, Providence and other American cities face many challenges today, including some of the same challenges that were discussed at this conference decades ago. Crumbling revenue streams, not to mention crumbling housing stock and infrastructure, struggling transportation systems, and unsustainable land use practices. So we decided on a different name altogether, which brings to mind many ideas. In 1630, John Winthrop gave a sermon to the future Massachusetts Bay colonists in which he prophesied that Boston would become a city upon a hill. In the years since Winthrop's speech, even this New England city has developed its share of challenges. The students involved in planning this conference and this event compiled a long list of topics for the conference. We weighted it down to 3 issues, as Professor Silver said, that we thought deserved the most attention in Providence: transportation, urban greening, and housing. For too long, decision makers in America's cities have operated on this proverbial and sometimes literal hill, working behind closed doors and excluding the groups of people whose lives the policies will affect the most. By getting the city off the hill, we hope to include all parties in decision-making and work together to address the problems confronting Providence and other American cities. All eyes are now on city stakeholders. It's time for everyone to work together to reach our common goals. We hope you enjoy the conference. Back to you.